Hi, this is Paul, and this is Rough Draft for Sunday, where I run through the current version of my Sunday sermon. The movie that got a lot of people, like in the Christian Reformed Church, who weren't supposed to go to movies, into the movie theaters was The Sound of Music. It was a story of a young woman who was going to be a nun, and she became the nanny for the governess for a group of children for a widower, and it was based on a true story. And then these people fled Nazi Germany and became the Von Trapp family singers, and they sung in Europe. And this became a movie and a musical by Rodgers and Hammerstein, and it was extraordinarily popular and memorable. And a lot of good Christian people, especially a lot of Dutch immigrants, said, well, this was against the Nazis, so it must be pro us, because the Dutch really resented the Nazi occupation and the bombing of Rotterdam, which I even heard about when I was in the Netherlands a couple of years ago. And in the movie, at one point, as the love story is developing between the woman who would be a nun and didn't become a nun, and the Baron who was a sea captain and didn't want to sail for the Nazis, they have this little song, and it's a lovely little song. Somewhere in my youth or childhood, I must have done something good. And I remember hearing this song as a kid, thinking about, what are they talking about? I have no idea what they're talking. What does that have to do with the story? And as I grew older and I became a little bit more familiar with a bunch of the world religions, it was like, oh, this is karma. Somewhere in my past, I must have done something good, and now the reward for it is this beautiful romantic love we have between us. How fortunate am I to be beloved by this other person? And you can vicariously place yourself in either role. But right there in the middle of this song, that was beloved by the Christian Reformed Church to the degree that even people who had sworn off going to movies forever went into the movie theater to hear this slightly veiled bit of karma go through. Now, when I say karma, some of you sort of get all, well, this is foreign religion, but the truth is, this is common religion. And common religion basically is a way of trying to figure out the world and how the world works. And you say, well, if I do good things, then good things happen. If I do bad things, then bad things happen. And usually right away, but even over time, and in fact, our own world is full of karma. We have many things that say, don't smoke, eat well, exercise, and you will have a longer life. And generally speaking, that's true, unless you get hit by a car, killed in a war, or develop cancer that you have a genetic predisposition towards that has nothing to do with your lifestyle. But this is basically what all common religions are based on. Do good and you'll receive good things. Do evil and you'll receive evil. Now, this was a pre-Enlightenment social fact. What do I mean by that? It was just sort of an assumption that the entire population carried around with it, and it sort of clothed itself in various religious forms. When I say karma, you can think of the religion of the people of the subcontinent of India. If you hear the law of sowing and reaping, you can hear people sort of appropriate something from the Old Testament. God or the gods are the enforcers of justice. This was simply assumed everywhere. And of course, that is what is beneath the book of Job. The book of Job finds the best man in the world. He's righteous in terms of his public justice. He's at the gate contending for the poor and the powerless, making sure that they don't get preyed upon by the wealthy and powerful. And he's also very pious in that he offers sacrifices for his children in case they sin. And so, of course, the accuser, the tempter, the Satan says to God, people are only good because of your karma, because of this justice system you set up. They're not really good. They're not authentically good, to drag a much more contemporary word down into it. They're just mercenary. And then the Lord says, have you considered my servant Job? And Satan says, he just proves the point. Look at how wealthy he is. Look at how blessed he is. Of course he's good. He wants to keep the gravy train running. And God says, all right, take away his stuff. And when that doesn't work, he says, okay, you can afflict his body, but don't take his life. Even Job's wife says to him, curse God and die. She understands. Everybody understands how the world works. But Job remains stubborn. And even Job's friends, who are all theologians of sorts, they come to Job and say, we know how the world works, Job. Surely there's a secret sin. Why don't you confess it and we'll be done with it? And Job says, no, there's no secret sin. I haven't done anything wrong. Now, over the last 500 years, the social facts have changed dramatically. And when you get cancer, it must be because of your genetics or your smoking or your poor eating or the environment that you lived in or something like this. There must be a material cause tied to the calamity that has befallen you. Now, this, of course, doesn't hit everyone or everything, because lots of people get hit by things that they're certainly blameless of. If you're a child in a war zone, you didn't cause this war. If you're born with birth defect, you didn't cause this birth defect. And so this has sort of scrambled the easy answers that people gave. Now, last week, we saw Paul and Luke are on a ship bound for Rome that is carried away and destroyed by a storm. And an angel tells Paul that God will send him to Rome, and as a gift, he will save the rest of the crew. Wow. Now, modern egalitarian people hear that gift idea and think, well, I don't like the idea of a God making decisions like that. You might say, okay, then they all drown. How's that for you? You like that option better? No. Why can't they all be saved? Maybe they can't be saved. Maybe we want water that can't drown, and maybe we want knives that can't cut, and maybe we want cancer that just grows forever and becomes huge things on our body. And we're asking for a world that doesn't really have any sort of consequence in it. That doesn't work. Well, how about ships that can't sink? Maybe we'll name them Titanic. Well, once safely ashore, we found that the island was called Malta. So Paul and Luke and the rest of the crew on now the destroyed ship wind up on Malta, 475 miles from where they got blown off course off of the coast of Crete. The islanders showed us unusual kindness. They built a fire and welcomed us all because it was raining and cold. So out of the water, and then suddenly what? Boy, the gods sure seem to be mean to you now. You get shaved from the shipwreck only to die of exposure on the beach. But the nice people of Malta build a fire, and there we go. Now, Paul is gathering driftwood. He's not sitting there, telling people to come, because after all, he saved them all from the ship, from the storm. So Paul gathers a pile of brushwood, and as he puts it into the fire, a viper, driven out by the heat, fastens itself on his hand. When the islanders saw the snake hanging from his hand, they said to each other, this man must have been a murderer. Though he escaped the sea, the god Justice has not allowed him to live. In other words, Poseidon tried to get him but didn't, and anybody who'd read the Iliad or the Odyssey would be very familiar with this kind of idea. In fact, most cultures in the world sort of agreed with this kind of idea, that when calamity strikes, it must be because you've done something wrong. But then you think it through, well, did everybody on the ship do something wrong, or only one of them? And last week, of course, we talked about Jonah and the storm that hit his work. Now, modern people read this and they have a whole variety of ideas. They say, this is that superstition of those pagan people. Those kind of people were dumb or ignorant or uneducated, and they just had the superstition around them. Or maybe maybe this was karma. Some people read that and think that. Well, science has changed the world. Now, this might be a really nice history lesson for us that say, well, look how ancient people believed, but history has changed, or Christianity has changed the world. It has science. But of course, Christian society gave birth to what we know as modern science. So, well, how does this work? Well, last week, of course, we looked at Jonah's storm and Jesus' storm and the man born blind. And the Bible says it isn't quite that simple. In fact, that goes all the way back to the book of Job. I should probably put Job in this picture. So things aren't quite as simple as we imagine. Here's the story of the man born blind. As he went along, he saw a man blind from birth. Now again, well, if you die in a war, it's because maybe you did something. Or if you die because something heavy falls on you, it's maybe because you did something. But he was blind from birth. And so his disciples, participating in this common religion to one degree or another, say, Rabbi, who sinned, this man or his parents, that he was born blind? It's a terrible thing to be plagued by, to be born blind. Jesus says, neither this man nor his parents sinned, said Jesus, but this happened so that the works of God might be displayed in him. As long as it is day, we must do the work of him who sent me. Night is coming when no one when no one can work. While I am in the world, I am the light of the world. Now this answer sort of mystifies us, but it's actually very much in common with the religion of Israel, because, well, nobody sinned, but the works of God might be displayed in him. And that sort of makes us feel uncomfortable too, because we're very autonomous and egalitarian and independent, and we think, who is God to get involved in my business if I didn't ask him? That's certainly not God's right. But this is a distinctly Hebrew perspective. A man called Ezekiel Kaufman, towards the beginning of the 20th century, wrote a really pretty incredible book where he looks at the religions that are available to him, and he said, a lot of people think that monotheism sort of evolved and they sort of put gods together. But I think actually what you read when you read the Bible is a very different perspective. A common religion sort of imagines that there's this meta-divine realm, and then there's these gods above us and creatures above us, and we sort of have to curry favor with them in order to have fine winds and good life and all of that. And then when bad things happen, it's because we ignored some god or crossed some god, and just many people all throughout the history of the world have sort of believed this. And you can find this in Homer, and you can find this in Rome, and you can find this all over the place. But for the Hebrews, there's no such meta-divine realm. Their Lord God is not just one of these other gods that down around him. This God is large and in charge, and there isn't anything above him. Now, so then you get to this story, and well, the people of Malta are participating in common religion, and they're interpreting events in a moral universe where there's bad fortune, and well, obviously Paul must have done something terrible so that the god of the sea wants him dead. And again, you can read the book of Jonah, and that was understood by the pagan. And then when they threw Jonah into the sea, the storm stopped. So, dunking, there's common religion proven, right? And then the Enlightenment comes along and says, that's not how nature works. It's not unusual to imagine there's a snake in the woodpile, and it's not unusual to imagine that Paul takes an armful of this and throws it in the bonfire, and when sensing that snake, the viper jumps out, and there's Paul's arm, and he hangs on to Paul's arm, and he bites him, and arms and poison and vipers lead to very realistic natural ends. Now, it's not that the people of Malta didn't understand what vipers do to people. They completely understood it, which is why they expected the outcome. And now Christians sort of know all of this too, and well, they sort of, in some ways God is in charge, but we're a little hesitant, given the book of Job, to just try to immediately presume we know exactly everything that's in the mix. But Paul shook the snake off into the fire and suffered no ill effects. The people expected him to swell up or suddenly fall over dead. But after waiting a long time and seeing nothing unusual happen to him, they changed their minds and said, he's a god. Now, I'm sure modern people would say something like, usually without a whole lot of experience with snakes and arms and poison, they'd say, well, maybe he's immune to it. And it's like, certainly snake bites will impact certain people differently, and some people will survive some snake bites and other people won't, but have no ill effects? That's really unusual. And then they'll start to doubt the story, and were there really poisonous snakes on Malta, and yada, yada, yada. They'll go through the whole thing. You can find plenty of stuff written about that. But, maybe they won't believe it. Well, the snake is hanging from his arm. That's a detail that Luke makes sure they put in the story, not such a quick glance or something like that. They were sure of it. So for the people in common religion, this is a revelatory event. And Luke watches all of this knowing exactly the way the ancient world works because he's a part of it. But he's also a Christian and he's watching this. And, well, he also remembers another story. A little bit earlier in the book of Acts, in Lystra, there sat a man who was lame, and he had been that way from birth. See, there it is. It's karma. There was a story a number of years ago where a Dutch soccer coach said publicly, he must have gotten into Eastern religions, and he sort of pronounced that people who are born with birth defects, they're getting what they deserve because they must have done bad things in a previous life. As tolerant as the Dutch society is, a lot of people didn't like the sound of that, and they complained. So this man was lame from birth, and he had never walked. And he listened to Paul as he was speaking. Paul's talking about the resurrection, and he's probably thinking, well, if God can raise Jesus from the dead, certainly he ought to be able to get me up on top of my legs. And then Paul looked directly at him and saw that he had faith to be healed and called out, "Stand on your feet." Oh. At that, the man jumped up and began to walk. When the crowd saw that Paul had done, they shouted in the Lycaonian language, "The gods have come down to us in human form." This is exactly their religion. Barnabas they called Zeus, and Paul they called Hermes because he was their chief speaker. Hermes, you say. The priest of Zeus, whose temple was just outside the city, brought bulls and wreaths to the city gates because he and the crowd wanted to offer sacrifices to them. Now, if Paul was sort of like a modern person who wanted to gain advantage, he could have sort of let them go, but Paul has a different mission entirely. But when the apostles, Barnabas and Paul, heard of this, they tore their clothes and rushed out into the crowd, shouting, "Friends, why are you doing this? We too are only human like you. We are bringing you good news, telling you to turn from these worthless things to the living God who made the heavens and the earth and the sea and everything in them. In the past, he let all nations go on their own way, yet he has not left himself without testimony. He has shown kindness by giving you rain from the heavens and crops in their season. He provides you with plenty of food and fills your hearts with joy." Even with these words, they had difficulty keeping the crowd from sacrificing to them. In other words, funny gods, keep talking. We understand how the world works. If you come to our town, we'd better offer sacrifices, or if you leave, bad things are going to happen to us. But the Jews aren't thinking this way. Of course, they're children of Hebrews. But they also don't like Paul, and then some of the Jews came from Antioch and Iconium and won the crowd over. Well, these are frauds. You're going to really upset Zeus and Hermes if you offer sacrifices to these guys. They stoned Paul and dragged him outside the city thinking he was dead. So Luke's seen this story before. And so, this change of event in Malta, not necessarily a good thing. But in Malta, it turns out okay. Now, there was an estate near that. I'm going to change this slide for a reason. Now, things go better for Paul in Malta than they went in Lystra. There was an estate nearby that belonged to Publius, the chief official of the island. He welcomed us to his home and showed us generous hospitality for 3 days. Well, you've got a whole ship full of Roman soldiers, and I don't know how many showed hospitality, probably as the big man of the island would do this for the people who came. His father was sick in bed, suffering from fever and dysentery. Paul went in to see him, and after prayer placed his hands on him and healed him. When this had happened, the rest of the sick on the island came and were cured. And they honored us in many ways. And when we were ready to sail, they furnished us with the supplies we needed. So, hard to know exactly what was on their mind. At Lystra, when Paul explains what's going on, they still didn't get it. But here, anybody reading this story who has read, well, they're reading the book of Acts, they probably read the book of Luke, it's like, Boy, this sounds like a Jesus story. This is the kind of thing Jesus did all the time. If you remember again, the first chapter of the book of Acts, and to me, this is a vital passage in the New Testament. After Jesus' crucifixion and resurrection, his disciples have gathered around him. And they asked, Lord, at this time are you to restore the kingdom to Israel? They're thinking about God's holy land and God's promised land and God's holy promised people, and thinking, now, why don't you clear out the Romans? And Jesus seemed to have a much bigger idea. And so Jesus says this, and it's kind of cryptic. It is not for you to know the times or the dates the Father has set by his own authority, but you will receive power when the Holy Spirit comes on you, and you will be my witnesses in Jerusalem and in all Judea and Samaria and to the ends of the earth. Now that's in the first chapter of the book of Acts. And here in the last chapter of the book of Acts, Paul, who wasn't there listening to Jesus say that, but Jesus appears to him on the road to Damascus, is doing exactly what Jesus said. Now, this is the type of demonstration of divinity that the religious world beyond Israel understood. This is common religion, and if you read Bart Ehrman's book, he'll be pretty clear that, well, this is exactly how Christianity won the Roman Empire, even though, ironically, for the thesis of this book, Bart Ehrman says, well, miracles couldn't have happened because miracles don't happen, but that's how Christianity won. So what you're telling me is that Christianity won because they were both exclusive and had the better miracles, but there weren't any miracles. So it's a funny thesis for a guy who doesn't believe in miracles. But Paul is in chains. I want to change this slide too. Oh, I didn't stop recording. I wonder where I started recording. So those of you watching the video get to see how the sausage is made. But Paul is in chains. Well, not physically in chains at that moment on the island, but Paul is a prisoner, and he's on his way to Rome, and he's going to be tried before Caesar, and not right away. We don't really know the details of how all that went down, but Paul will be killed. Paul is living unlimited time, and he's going to be killed by the Roman emperor, and Roman emperor who believed in common religion. A lot of people would say, well, how can such a great prophet, or a god, whatever category they want to put him in, who can survive a shipwreck and shake off a poisonous snake, don't forget the serpent in the garden, that will certainly be on people's minds, be subjugated like this and remain in prison? Certainly such a god could break the chains like a superhero, or wind some way around to not have to suffer the indignities that, we ordinary normal people who aren't shaking poisonous chains from our poisonous snakes from our arms, or have track records of healing whole islands full of sick people. What about that? We've talked about this quite a bit. I'm going to add another thing to this. Because by the rules of common religion, glorious people like Alexander the Great, is declared a god because of the superior way in which they manage things in the world. Now, common religion and science and natural law and all these kinds of ideas have something in common. They believe that the universe has a structure, and that if you can figure out the structure, you can play in the structure, and doing good things gets you good ends. And I'm not going to say that eating right and exercising and taking care of yourself and saving your money and getting a good education and being good to your children and all of those really good things, there are really good things. And generally speaking, most of the time, if you do good, you'll have better outcomes. But we all know that that's not always the case either. And so what's going on? There's all sorts of cause and effects, and these things don't go away. But Jesus, Job, and Paul demonstrate that there's always more to the story. And in fact, Israel's story demonstrates that, because much of the point of what Christians call the Old Testament says that Israel failed to keep the covenant. Book after book says that. Israel failed to keep the covenant and so received the judgment of God in the Babylonian exile and the destruction of the northern kingdom by Assyria. And then while they were still under the thumb of pagan empires when Jesus comes, well, surely they have to get their act together. And, there were many different competing groups in Israel that had various ideas of getting their act together. And, well, some were going to stay in the desert and pray in caves. Others were going to kill Romans. Others were going to try to police the moral behavior of common Israelites. But if they could only sort of get their herd immunity karmic quotient high enough, then finally you would tip the scales and God would come and do a big thing, and then you'd be on top of the world. The Apostle Paul doesn't quite see it that way, because as he says, while we were yet sinners, Christ died for us. In other words, it wasn't the case that we sort of got our act together and our goodness reached critical mass and we got over the hump, and then God said, well, you finally put enough coins in the till, I'll give you what you earned. No, nothing like that. And Paul, in fact, shows, even by his own God's choice of Paul, that, in some ways he was very scrupulous and righteous according to the covenant, but he's hunting down the church. And so, how do you do that math? Paul shows that God will deliver him from the sea and the serpents, sort of Genesis 1 and Genesis 3, but he too should be take and not talk the path of Christ. Now, it's I guess some would find it a lovely romantic idea that somewhere in my youth or childhood I must have done something good, and therefore, well, here I am standing here loving you. That's the way the beautiful song goes, whether or not I should. Oh, little drama. But of course, they're both good-looking people who receive their genetics from their parents, and they received their raising by their parents and their culture, and they received a whole bunch of cause and effects that have led them there to that little place where they are in fact falling in love. And it doesn't take a brain surgeon to imagine you've got a lonely widower, a wealthy baron, and who's a ship captain. My goodness! Then you have a young, virginal, would-be nun. I mean, it's no rocket science here that there's going to be sparks. And there's nothing wrong with them marrying. I could probably do a little bit of Googling to figure out how much older he was than her. In the movie, they're not that necessarily very close in age. The old baroness who won't play very nicely with the ball because she'll get her dress dirty no matter how they try. Somehow in that story, there's a whole bunch of American values creeping into that movie from the... I didn't even look up. I didn't do my due diligence and look up what year the movie was made. Someone will do it and put it in the comments section, I'm sure. But what if you missed the window? What if your parents were homely? What if, in fact, you took all of the good things that were given to you by birth or by being born a particular culture and place and time, having good moral parents? What if you squandered everything that you've been given? It's your own darn fault. What then? What if you failed your great test? What if you were mired in rebellion so deep you couldn't get out of it? Now, Jesus, who showed himself the master of the storm and the defeater of serpents, think about the temptations in the wilderness, subjected himself voluntarily, bore our twisted notion of justice, and became a ransom for many. While we were yet sinners, mired too deep, God died. Jesus died for us. Now in Numbers, the Israelites were told to look to the serpent on the staff and live. And of course, this gets picked up by the Gospel of John. And look to the man on the cross, the one, well, he must have done something wrong to deserve to hang on a tree. He should be despised. Nobody hangs on a tree unless they deserve it. There's a fair amount of Muslims that continue to think that Jesus didn't get killed because God would never let such a great prophet find such a disaster. It's exactly what someone might have thought of the Apostle Paul. So we look to him who became sin for us so that we might live. Now, if you've been given this gift, how should you live after receiving such a gift? Should you walk around prideful that you somehow have been given a gift? No, you don't. Gifts are given by the mercy of someone else. You didn't earn them. They were given to you. Maybe you should have courage. Maybe you should have generosity. Maybe you should live on your mission. Maybe you should be filled with joy. Maybe you should be filled with hope, knowing that nothing can separate you from the love of God, even the trials that assail. Now, we have been given the gift, struggle still, and we wonder, and we don't know, but the purpose of rehearsing the story is to remind us. We've been given a gift. Why are we afraid? Why are we downcast? Well, maybe we're afraid and downcast because of the circumstances around us, and fair enough. But if you believed you've been given a gift, if you believed you have been loved, if you believed, in fact, even though you didn't do something good in your childhood, you've been given something good, well, you should live like it. Amen. Thanks for watching either this Rough Draft for Sunday or one of the catechism lessons. And if you've watched this and you've appreciated it, and maybe the last slide in the rough draft was gratitude, here's the website for Livingstone's Christian Reformed Church. And because of Livingstone's Christian Reformed Church, I do these sermons and lessons. And if you ever want to see how the final draft looks like, you can always go to the Livingstone's CRC website. We are the Livingstone CRC YouTube. These links are always below in my notes. And you can see the Sunday version. Now, we've been working on the sound, and it should continue to get better, thanks to the donations of many of you. But if you'd like to continue to support this ministry, and those of you who have been supporting this ministry, this church would not be doing what it's doing without the generous support of many of you. So I say thank you. But if you would like to give to the church and support the church, you can go to the website. I'll put the link below, and you can give online. And if you hit the give online now, it'll take you there. You can give by text. That number is there. And you can download the Livingstone CRC app, and you can give on the app as well. So we really appreciate the donations of many of you who have given to the church and keep these sermons and other church lessons going. And if you enjoy these and want to share with the church, here's a way. And if you live in the United States and pay U.S. taxes, you'll get a tax donation receipt at the end of the year. So thank you for watching.